Hello and welcome to section 2.5 for Econ 2 on the AQA exam board. What will we see today? Today we'll be looking at saving, borrowing and the economic implications of both savings and borrowing. Households receive income from the factors of production which they provide to firms. Households can then choose what to do with this income. They choose how much of their income they wish to consume and how much they wish to save. If households choose to save some of their income, it adds to their wealth. Wealth is a stock and income is a flow. If individuals choose to save some of their income, it adds to their wealth. Individuals can also consume part of their wealth and use it in consumption now, i.e. they can dissave. This would result in the wealth of individuals falling as they are consuming some of their wealth in this period. From an individual's income, we can work out their savings ratio, which is the percentage of someone's disposable income that they save. A low saving ratio means that there is a high level of consumption. But what influences the amounts that economic agents save? One factor that influences how much economic agents save is the real interest rate. The real interest rate is worked out by doing the nominal interest rate minus inflation. The nominal interest rate is the reward for saving. It is money that you receive for depositing your money in a savings account. An example of a nominal interest rate would be 3%. Suppose I saved £100 for a year and the nominal interest rate was 3% a year. I would gain £3 in interest. So after a year's time I would get my £100 saving back and I would get £3 in interest. Savings is income that the saver is keeping for future consumption. So by saving, an individual is foregoing current consumption and instead choosing to consume in the future. However, over time, the price of goods and services changes, and this is known as inflation. Inflation erodes the value of savings and decreases the incentive to save. Suppose that there was a high level of inflation in an economy, and this level of inflation was greater than the nominal interest rate. This would mean that the real interest rate is negative. A negative real interest rate means that in the future I will be able to consume fewer goods. This is because the return that I have got on my savings, which is the nominal interest rate, is less than the level of inflation. A positive value for the real interest rate means that a consumer will be able to consume more goods and services in the future if they save. The higher the real interest rate is, the greater incentive there is to save, and this is because future consumption for this individual will be higher. We'll now just go through a maths example for the real interest rate. Suppose that the nominal interest rate was 5%, and inflation was 3%, the real interest rate will be 5%, which is the nominal interest rate, minus 3%, which is inflation, and that gives us a real interest rate of 2%. As the real interest rate is positive, it means that an individual can consume more goods and services in the future. Let's use another example. Suppose now that the nominal interest rate is 7% and inflation is 10%. We work out the real interest rate by doing the nominal interest rate minus inflation. The nominal interest rate was 7% and inflation was 10%, so we do 7% minus 10%, which gives us a value of minus 3%. A negative value for the real interest rate means that a consumer will be able to consume less goods in the future if they choose to save. Here, the consumer has an incentive to consume now rather than save and consume in the future because they will be able to consume more goods now. Another influence for saving is expectations. Expectations are crucial in economics. If consumer confidence is high, individuals will be less likely to save and instead will consume a greater proportion of their income. However, if consumer confidence was low, for example in a recession, consumers would be worried about what the future will bring and instead may choose to increase their saving levels because they may be unsure that they are able to keep their job and want to save some money for the future as a precautionary step. Another influence on the savings rate is the government's tax policy or schemes that they use to encourage savings. In the UK, we have ISAs, which enable individuals to place around £15,000 a year into a savings account, which is tax-free. This provides an incentive for economic agents within the UK to save. So the three key influences for savings are the real interest rate, expectations, and tax or government policy towards savings. So now let's move on to the influences for borrowing. The main influence for borrowing is the real interest rate. The higher the real interest rate is, the greater the cost of borrowing is for the individual, and the less inclined an individual will be willing to borrow. A high real interest rate could come about when there is very low inflation and high nominal interest rates for borrowing. Borrowing is an individual foregoing future consumption in order to consume now. The individuals borrow money from a bank or another individual. They consume goods and services now, and then they pay back the money that they have borrowed and the nominal interest rates that they have agreed. If there is a high real interest rate, it means that an individual is foregoing a greater amount of consumption of goods and services in the future in order to consume now. This results in the individual having less of an incentive to borrow now because they will have to forego a greater amount of consumption in the future. The opposite is the case when borrowing is cheap. This could be because inflation is fairly high and nominal interest rates are fairly low. When this is the case, it means that an individual has to forego less future consumption in order to consume now. Another factor that influences borrowing is the availability of credit. If credit is readily available, then individuals and firms are more likely to take on debt. After the financial crisis of 07-08, individuals found it harder to borrow from financial institutions, as financial institutions were less willing to lend out money. Banks were also more picky with who they would grant mortgages to and also required larger deposits for mortgages. As banks and financial institutions were less willing to lend money out, it meant that there was a lower amount of credit in the economy. Also, during a recession, economic agents usually choose to deleverage themselves. This means that they choose to pay off debts that they currently have. Expectations about the future also influence borrowing rates. If a consumer is worried about the future, then it is less likely that they will choose to borrow. Likewise, if a firm is worried about the future, it is less likely that they will also choose to borrow. On the contrary, if both firms and individuals believed that the future was going to be good and it was going to be prosperous, where we'll have strong economic growth, low inflation, etc., then they would be more inclined to borrow now. But what are the importance of savings? Savings levels have a powerful influence on economic performance. This is because they can be lent out to small businesses who can use these funds to grow or invest. Also, a lot of pension fund capital goes into the stock market, which allows larger companies to expand their production, grow, and invest. If saving levels in an economy are high, and providing that investment is widely used, then the productive potential of an economy can increase. This shows that savings have a supply side effect on the economy. The amount of savings and the demand for borrowing has an influence on the nominal interest rate. If there is a low level of savings and a high demand for borrowing, it will result in a high nominal interest rate. This would increase the real interest rate, providing that inflation remained constant, and this would decrease the incentive for firms to invest. This can have an influence on the supply side of the economy and restricts growth. Savings are also important because savings add to the stock of wealth for an individual. This stock of wealth can be used as a buffer against uncertain times, i.e., if this individual got made redundant, and the savings can also be used to allow the individual to retire earlier or have a higher standard of living during retirement. The individuals could use their own savings to supplement the pension that they get from the government. However, sometimes if the savings level is too high, it can have adverse effects on an economy. If economics agents choose to save rather than consume, aggregate demand will shift inwards, and this may result in a negative output gap. This is because individuals are choosing to save their income rather than consuming it, and this will cause a drop in consumption. As consumption is one component of aggregate demand, it means that a fall in consumption will shift aggregate demand inwards, and this is why there may be a negative output gap in the economy. After the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, there was a global savings glut whereby economic agents were saving more than they were borrowing. The savings glut was so big that some economists were arguing that there should be negative interest rates. This means that if you deposit money at a bank, rather than receiving money for depositing money, the bank actually charges you money. For example, we could have a negative interest rate of minus 1%. So I would deposit £100 now, and then in a year's time, I would get my £100 back, and then usually if there was a positive interest rate, you would get the interest on that. However, with a negative interest rate, I would then have to pay £1 back to the bank for the privilege of them holding my money. However, with interest rates, there is an issue of zero lower bound constraint, i.e., if you charge a negative interest rate, individuals will choose to keep their money at home, stash it under their bed, rather than choosing to put it in a bank. This is because if you keep it at home, you gain zero interest, which means that your £100 stays at £100, which is better than if you give it to a bank, whereby you have to pay £1 in interest. There has got to be a balance between savings and consumptions, and the government and the central bank can use various different methods to control both. We will look at some of these methods in more detail later on in the course.